We can now bring in Jeffrey Sachs, professor at Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Now, yesterday we had Donald Trump who put out a statement saying that the tone and spirit of the call were excellent, his call with Vladimir Putin, and that Russia and Ukraine would now essentially be sitting down to figure out an end to this war. Is Washington washing its hands clean of the diplomatic efforts it's undertaken?
Well, I think Washington is saying there should be an agreement on peace, not simply a short-term ceasefire. And this is what President Trump has rightly been saying. The problem in Europe is that the Europeans don't speak about any conditions of peace at all, other than completely unrealistic positions that make no sense. Europe is still stuck as if the last 5 years had not happened. Europe is still pushing for NATO enlargement, which is not going to happen. It's pushing for European boots on the ground in Ukraine, which is not going to happen. So the problem in Europe is sanctions, 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 but no sensible talk about a peace agreement. President Trump, on the other hand, has put on the table conditions for peace, including Ukrainian neutrality, which is obviously the way to get to peace in Ukraine. And it's time for Europe to stop, I don't know, the 97 zillionth round of sanctions and get on with what are the conditions for actually having peace. And that starts with neutrality.
Professor Sachs, I want to jump in there because, yes, Europe has agreed to a 17th round of sanctions today, and they say an 18th round of sanctions is in the work. These sanctions haven't really halted changed Russia's thinking or halted its offensive on the ground in Ukraine. Ukraine now acknowledges that this conflict will be settled on the negotiating table. It didn't think so maybe a year ago. That seems to have changed. There is a shift in thinking from the Ukrainian perspective, but when it comes to Russia's red lines, those don't seem to change.
Well, there are 3 points to what needs to be done. One is neutrality, the second is security guarantees, and the third is the settlement on territories. Let's get down to the specifics. And Europe, Macron and Merz and Starmer and Tusk, all they do is they meet with Zelensky every day, but they don't talk about the terms of the settlements on the questions of neutrality, security, and territory. All they do is repeat the same lines.
But to be fair, from the Ukrainian perspective, they're scared that if they remain neutral or whatever, then tomorrow you're going to have Russia that's going to come in and try and invade the country once again.
I know, but that's what you negotiate about. You know, anyone involved in negotiations.
Who is going to oversee whatever eventual settlement comes into force? Because what the French and British are proposing is essentially boots on the ground of France and Britain in Ukraine, and that is something that Russia will never accept. So we're back to square one.
What's ridiculous about the French and the British position is that they don't go to meet and speak with the Russians about these issues. These are issues of real concern, but all they do is shout at the sidelines.
But Donald Trump has spoken to the Russians. But Donald Trump has spoken to the Russians, and we still don't know what is palatable for them.
Donald Trump has spoken with the Russians and done a good job of saying, let's get down to negotiations. The Europeans have not said that yet. This is the big mistake of Europe. This is the big mistake.
When it comes to what Ukraine would have to agree to, would it have to be giving up Crimea? Because it doesn't seem that they'd be willing to let go of the territory that is under Russian occupation right now.
Well, certainly Ukraine will have to agree to neutrality because the whole cause of this war was this senseless, ridiculous push of NATO up to Russia's border. This is obvious and clear, and everybody involved in this for the last 15 years privately knows this, but the European leaders won't say it publicly. So this is the first thing. They will have to agree to neutrality. The idea of NATO enlargement never should have been put on the table. It was a cause of war from the start.
But given I was just saying, given that Donald Trump has effectively ruled out Ukraine joining NATO, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen, even though there are some European leaders who continue to to suggest that it could one day.
I agree. And as long as they continue to suggest that it could one day, it holds back peace. Let's get to a real agreement. You know, one European leader said to me privately, "Oh, it's not going to happen." I said, "Well, why don't you tell your own people that?" He said, "That's an interesting thought." The truth is that a lot is said in private that is not said in public. The European leaders need to stop the warmongering, the 17th, the 18th round of sanctions, and talk about how to make peace. What are their concerns? Yes, it's a good question. If we make peace, how do you know the war won't start again? That's something you negotiate at the peace table. You don't just shout on the sidelines that you have doubts. You get down to negotiations. Diplomats have done this for millennia, but the Europeans won't even engage in diplomacy right now. They meet with Zelensky 100 times and Putin not at all.
So do you think that the fact that the Europeans have had this posturing is why they have not been included at whatever settlement between Russia and Ukraine? Is that why? Because the U.S. has been successful up until now.
Of course. And by the way, the Europeans don't need the United States to talk to Russia. They need to pick up the phone or use my Zoom account or buy a plane ticket or invite President Putin to meet someplace. It's the Europeans that have rejected direct discussions with Putin for years. The Europeans, they don't need American permission for that. They just need to have diplomacy. They forgot diplomacy many years ago. And they need to get back to diplomacy.
But Professor Sachs, final question, because just last week we had the U.S. President Donald Trump, who was in the Middle East, and he said this war is not going to end until he meets with Vladimir Putin. Then he had this phone call yesterday and suggested, no, it's not up to me, it's up to them to figure it out. If he just meets Putin, I mean, considering that Joe Biden was the president and, under his leadership, the war in Ukraine broke out. Russia went and invaded invaded Ukraine in 2022. Shouldn't he be meeting Vladimir Putin and ending it?
Yeah, the war broke out under Biden, and Biden missed every chance to end the war. He, in fact, talked the Ukrainians out of agreeing in the Istanbul process to an agreement which was almost negotiated. We need diplomacy now. The Europeans don't have to wait on the United States to engage directly with the Russians. The United States should continue to engage directly with the Russians. But I'll say one thing. The U.S. military aid for Ukraine is basically at an end. And that's the real fact. For Ukraine to survive right now, to stop losing so many lives, to stop having its territorial destruction, we need a peace agreement. We should be hurrying to get that accomplished. And Europe should stop endless sanctions and engage in actual diplomacy.
Very short answer. Do you think that your U.S. Military aid to Ukraine is going to wind up?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
It's basically coming to a trickle because what was voted under Biden is finishing up, and Trump's not going to go back and ask for more.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.